Hello and welcome once again to the West Cork History Festival 2021. This year, for evident reasons, we are an entirely online festival, but we're delighted to have as our next speaker, Dr. Donal Lowry. Donal is senior member at Regent's Park College, Oxford, and has worked for many years on aspects of imperial history, with a particular focus on Africa and on broader Dominion history, but also with a really interesting connection to the Irish experience within that imperial construct. And he will talk now on the subject, everything that touches Ireland finds an echo in the remotest parts of the empire, the Dominion dimensions of the Anglo-Irish Settlement, 1916 to 1922. Donal, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Simon. Thank you so much for inviting me as well. Well, rather like a clergyman, I'll just say, if I just begin by saying that the title is taken from the speech of George V at the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament in June 1921, which was incidentally, and I'll be returning to this, substantially influenced by the South African Prime Minister and statesman Jan Christian Smuts. Everything that touches Ireland finds an echo in the remotest parts of the empire, he wrote, or he said, I should say. The eyes of the whole empire are on Ireland today, that empire in which so many nations and races have come together in spite of ancient feuds, and in which new nations have come forth to birth within the lifetime of the youngest in this hall. Now, in the decade of centenaries, much has been made of the global impact of Irish nationalism on the process of decolonization in India and later Black Africa. And of course, more recently in the parallels which are drawn between the partition of India and the partition of Palestine, for example. Now, I think a distinction needs to be drawn by historians between comparisons between Ireland and other parts of the empire just mentioned, and those comparisons and parallels that occur to the participants at the time of Irish independence and partition. And these, and the ones which were more specifically in the minds of the leading statesmen, and they were men for the most part, of the time. So I'm not really interested so much in comparing these situations, but in highlighting the comparisons which occurred to people involved in the situation at the time. Now, the one parallel which I will be highlighting is South Africa, which Nicholas Mansberg, who was a great Irish historian of the Commonwealth, and not only of the Commonwealth, but also of Ireland and of South Africa and of India, pointed out that the most striking parallel and precedent for the Anglo-Irish Treaty was the South African settlement of 1910, which resulted from the end of the South African War and the negotiations which led to the creation of the Union of South Africa as a dominion in the Commonwealth in 1910. And that parallel, of course, goes back much further. It goes back through to the 1880s, when the Irish Parliamentary Party became interested in South Africa. And of course, Cecil Rhodes donated £10,000 to Charles Stewart Parnell in order to persuade him to support the idea of imperial federation, that Ireland would become a self-governing part of the British Empire rather than break away entirely into a sort of republican trajectory. And incidentally, this had quite an interesting influence, which is not often thought about, but in the First Home Rule Act, or First Home Rule Bill of Gladstone in the 1880s, it was foreseen that Ireland would have no longer have representation at Westminster, and would entirely be governed from Dublin with an oversight from the British Parliament, which would have no Irish representatives. It was not, or largely as a result of Rhodes's persuasion of Parnell and of the Parliamentary Party, that in the second Home Rule Bill, in the early 1890s, that it was envisaged that that Ireland would have a continuing representation after Home Rule was granted. And this indeed continued and survived into the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which ensured that Northern Ireland would go on having representation of Westminster. So there's a sort of curious, unlikely lineage between Cecil Rhodes and the continuation of Northern Ireland within the Westminster parliamentary system. Canada also was another parallel which was heavily drawn on at the time because of the granting in 1867 of Dominion status to Canada, which brought together French Canadians and Anglo Canadians in a confederation. And this was seen as a success story, and one which the idea of devolving more and greater responsibility to Dominion subjects was followed in Australia in 1901, in New Zealand in 1907, and in South Africa in 1910. And it's the South African parallel which it provides the strongest influence. I should also mention passing, although there's no need to rehearse the connection here, that there was a strong pro-Boer movement in Ireland during the South African War. Indeed, Roy Foster has highlighted what he calls the galvanic effect of the Boer War. In this, as in others, nearly as crucial an event for Irish nationalism as the death of Parnell. So there was that also to build on. But it also followed this connection, which of course lived on through the Irish Transvaal Committee, which became the nucleus for many advanced nationalists of the Sinn Féin movement founded by Arthur Griffith, another South African sort of veteran of South Africa. It also lived on in the parliamentary party. John Redmond's leadership, his ability to lead the party was facilitated by the coming together during the Boer War of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which had fragmented after the death of Parnell. Meanwhile, unionists in Ireland generally, and in the North particularly, long regarded nationalist solidarity with the Boers as symptomatic of Irish betrayal, and right up to not only up to the Home Rule crisis of 1911-14, but even much later, even as late as the early 60s with Lord Brookborough, this memory of Irish pro-Boerism would survive. Now, the other reason why the South African parallel became so important, and very briefly to run through them, in 1907, the British government followed through a commitment made at the end of the South African War to restore self-government to the defeated Boer republics in the Transvaal and the Orange River colony. And this was lauded at the time by many, especially on sort of radicals and liberals, as a magnanimous gesture, a tremendous act of generosity and of reconciliation by the British to bring together Afrikaners, defeated Afrikaners and English South Africans, and also to promote some sort of future federation or union between them and the two British colonies in Natal and the Cape Colony. And in the same year, elections brought to the fore the former Boer generals Louis Botha and General Jan Christian Smuts. Now, Botha had fought the British to the bitter end before surrendering on their terms in 1902. And Smuts, who was equally resolute, precociously clever, regarded as one of the most brilliant students ever to come through Cambridge University, became Botha's trusted lieutenant. Botha was seen as charismatic and warm-hearted, while the cerebral Smuts was seen as well-connected and highly respected in metropolitan society. History writes the word reconciliation over all her quarrels, he told the British government in 1905. And the new government in South Africa, which was created, represented this, at least this aura of reconciliation, while there were still people who regarded it as a betrayal of what the Boers had been fighting for. Now, Botha and Smuts were seen as exemplary embodiments of this new and enlightened imperial policy of granting or devolving ever more authority, even to defeated enemies. They were romanticized on the left, and certainly by liberals in British politics. They were the Old Testament figures of David and Jonathan brought to life. They were the George Washington and Alexander Hamilton of New South Africa. They were heroic warriors turned statesmen, and likened to the patrician of classical Rome, Cincinnatus, and leading the plough and going off to war, but also having the maturity and virtue to negotiate and return to normal politics. Against the background of this reform, this era of reform, it was thought that the Liberal government could now do what it did for the Boers would do for Ireland, and make Redmond into an Irish Botha, as Sir Robert Ensor notes in his History of England. This was the slogan which went around. Now, Redmond was very aware of this parallel because it was regarded as a great achievement of British statesmanship to facilitate coming together in South Africa. And he used the Transvaal and the Botha parallel in his efforts to keep Asquith, the new Prime Minister's, attention focused on Home Rule, reminding opponents that Botha had also been regarded as disloyal until self-government had been conceded to him. So he said, as he also pointed out, Canada, Australia, and the Transvaal were alike regarded as disloyal when their rights were being eroded by the imperial government, but could equally now be turned to a position of loyalty. He also used the occasion of the re-granting of self-government to the South African defeated Boers to state that our stake in the empire is too large for us to be detached from it. We Irish have peopled the waste spaces of Greater Britain. Our roots are imperial as well as national. He also, he had to, of course, he had to straddle different factions within the parliamentary party, because, of course, there was still a residual nostalgia for Parnell. There was also people who had supported Michael Davitt, the Irish Land League leader, who was an enthusiastic pro-Boer. But also, Redmond knew that many of his supporters revered in Botha and the Boers those idealized characteristics they most admired in themselves, a rural, agricultural, and deeply religious people. If only he believed these sentiments could be harnessed to the cause of Irish self-government. So Redmond's strategy, therefore, seemed to increase his continual leverage with the Liberal government, while outmaneuvering more radical nationalists back home. In 1911, for example, his parliamentary party hosted a banquet at Westminster on the fringes of the conference, where the speeches of various colonial statesmen in support of Home Rule were recalled. So there he sort of aligning himself with the colonial statesmen. And the South African analogy began to attract the attention of journalists as well, including Erskine Childers in his book, The Framework of Home Rule, which a position he would later distance himself from. Lionel Curtis of the Milner Kindergarten and J.L. Garvin, editor of The Observer, also took a keen interest in this parallel. But events in Ireland began to frustrate these developments, with ripple effects across the British Empire. In 1912, when the British government introduced a Home Rule Bill for Ireland, offering limited devolution, Andrew Bonar Law, Canadian born, of course, and other leading statesmen and figures such as Rudyard Kipling, Starr Jemison of the Raid, and Lord Milner began to advocate resisting Home Rule by force if necessary, and were supported by loyalists from Toronto and Calgary to Melbourne and Auckland. I think we forget these days the imperial stage on which the Anglo-Irish crisis following the Home Rule Bill of 1912 wider, much wider scale and platform which that was enacted, with sentiments animating people across the globe. If Redmond was potentially an Irish Botha, there was also another worry. Irish and Ulster loyalists found a parallel in the English-speaking settlers of southern and eastern Africa, where the Rhodesian analogy with Ireland was frequently made. The White Rhodesians were constantly compared at that time in their resistance to an arbitrary ruling company to the Ulster Protestants, and they began to use the phrase that Rhodesia will fight and Rhodesia will be right, and this admiration for direct action. Tom Casement, the brother of the humanitarian turned rebel Sir Roger Casement, highlighted his sense of crisis to General Smuts. Tom Casement was a friend of General Smuts and served with him on his staff in East Africa during the First World War. "It's a great pity you and General Botha are not in power in Ireland," Casement wrote. "I think Carson and co. would now be on the water." Good temperance analogy there, I think. When the war broke out in 1914, it's significant that this connection comes to the fore, that on the very day that the Home Rule Bill was being debated and Unionist members quit the House of Commons in protest, Redmond held up before Parliament the example of reconciliation provided by South Africa. The whole world has been struck by the spectacle of unity in the empire, from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and last, not least, from South Africa and Ireland. No one can have read unmoved the magnificent speeches of General Botha and General Smuts. Just as Botha and Smuts have been able to say that the concession of free institutions in South Africa has changed the men who but 10 or a little more years ago were your bitter enemies in the field to your loyal comrades and fellow citizens in the empire, just as I can truthfully say to you that Ireland has been transformed from the broken arm of England into one of the strongest bulwarks of the empire. So this, John Dillon also echoed this view that General Botha is now one of the most honoured men in the whole of the British Empire. He is the sole trust of England in South Africa, and if they had not trusted him, they would have been cleared out of South Africa. How could the English people have dared to go to war with South Africa enslaved and Ireland denied her freedom? She could only do so because she has firmly set aside the policy of the Tory party and has given liberty to South Africa and placed the Irish Home Rule Act on the statute books. So again, you've got this explicit parallel being drawn. Dillon's optimism proved to be misplaced, however, especially in South Africa. For on the outbreak of war in 1914, General Christian de Wet, one of the leading Boer generals, sensed that Britain's difficulty was South Africa's opportunity to sever the imperial connection. Brigadier General Christian Bears was of like mind and resigned his position as commander of the Union Defence Force, and was mortally wounded shortly afterwards in a clash with the South African Army. The rebellion was subsequently suppressed by Generals Botha and Smuts, decisively acting against their former comrades in support of the imperial war effort, a parallel that would be recalled in Ireland later on for reasons that you can guess. Many poor and disaffected whites had rallied to the insurgents, threatening for a time this most strategically vital region of the empire. Redmond was keenly aware of the significance of this rebellion, reminding the House of Commons that Botha too had to face serious racial animosity, that is, between Boers and Britons, in South Africa, where Botha had to face his Sinn Féiners, as he put it. "I honestly believe in my own heart," Redmond said, "that Botha's difficulties were in reality small compared to the difficulties that my colleagues and I had to face in Ireland, where at the outbreak of war, in contrast with Botha's newly autonomous South Africa, a home rule administration had not yet been created." No less aware of the strategic opportunity provided by Britain's difficulty was Patrick Pearse. In 1914, he'd warned, "Whenever England goes on a mission of empire, we meet and we strike at her. Yesterday it was on the South African veldt, Tomorrow it may be on the streets of Dublin. He also noted how, reputedly, Cecil Rhodes smuggled guns inside pianos into Johannesburg in preparation for the Jameson raid. James Connolly, the Irish syndicalist and socialist leader, also believed that, quote, the Boers had pricked the bubble of England's fighting reputation, but regretted that this, what he called, mischance to throw off the imperial yoke in 1899 to 1902 had been missed. Almost all the key planners of the rebellion had been ardent pro-Boers, including Sean McDiarmid, who kept a greyhound called Kruger. Sir Roger Casement, a celebrated humanitarian, who had once praised the Boers granting self-government to the Boers, praised the British granting self-government to the Boers, now advocated a rebellion with German assistance, and he welcomed news of the 1914 rebellion in South Africa. Major John McBride, the former commander of the Irish Transvaal Brigade, also lent his support to the Easter Rising. Now, of course, that rising took Redmond and his colleagues largely by surprise, but South African echoes were present. Articles in the Irish Volunteer Journal have been emphasizing the strategy and exploits of General de Wet. Although in the event, a much more static action confined to Dublin largely followed, many of the insurgents wore Boer-style headgear known as Cronje hats after General Cronje, and adopted the Boer rank of commandant, still preserved in today's Irish Army. The Socialist Citizen Army, of course, had been trained by Captain Jack White, another veteran maverick of the South African War. The executions which followed the rising also brought South Africa to mind. McBride was executed for no reason, it would seem, other than the fact that he had led one of the Irish brigades in 1899 to 1902. It's not absolutely proven, but it seems the most likely explanation. Pleas for clemency drew on the president of the Afrikaner Rebellion of 1914, when Prime Minister Louis Botha had spared all but one who had been one of his former comrades from execution. On the 29th of April, while Dublin was still in insurrection, Redmond received a telegram from Botha expressing his heartfelt sympathy for the Irish leader and expressing his regret that a small section in Ireland are jeopardizing a great cause. Redmond, who condemned the Easter Rising, observed that Botha was facing similar problems with extreme nationalists who were keen to take advantage of British wartime difficulties to establish a separatist republic. On the 10th of May, in the House of Commons, he called on Prime Minister Asquith to follow Botha's example and halt the executions immediately. His deputy, Dillon, pointed out that Botha had only executed a single ringleader, Yoppie Fourie, who becomes a sort of hero, very similar to Rory O'Connor in Ireland in many ways, in Afrikaner nationalism, sort of martyred Republican hero. When a friend suggested to James Connolly, the badly wounded socialist leader of the Rising, that the British would never shoot him because of his wounds, he responded, remember Skeepers. This was a reference to the Cape rebel Gideon Skeepers, whom the British had helped recover from his wounds before executing him in 1902. So again, it shows they were quite well informed, these people. They'd read the news, they followed the Reuters reports of the time, and these figured in their thoughts. Newspapers throughout Ireland were also keenly aware of the contrasting policies of Botha and Maxwell, the British commander in Dublin. The Catholic Bishop of Limerick, Edward O'Dwyer, hitherto regarded as largely conservative, wrote to Maxwell contrasting the harsh measures meted out to the Easter insurgents with the lenience shown to the Jameson raiders of 1896, when, as he put it, a number of buccaneers invaded a friendly state and brought the forces of a lawful government and fought the forces of a lawful government. Geoffrey Dawson, editor of The Times and a former member of Milner's Kindergarten, believed that Redmond and Dillon were now in a far weaker position than they were before the Rising, one that was not unlike that of Botha and Smuts, but as he asserted, they were far bigger, that is Botha and Smuts, bigger and more dominant men. Now we move back to the constitutional situation, where again the parallel becomes quite dominant. In December 1916, Lloyd George sought, having come to power as Prime Minister, sought to diffuse the Irish crisis, which was having an impact on debates about conscription in Canada and Australia. While Redmond's parliamentary party was being eclipsed by the Sinn Féin party, Lloyd George called a constitutional convention drawn from a cross-section of Irish society that was explicitly modelled on the South African Convention of 1908 to 1909 that had led to the creation of the Union of South Africa as a dominion. The dominions of Canada and South Africa had, respectively it seemed, reconciled Francophones and Afrikaners with Anglophone loyalists. Thus it was thought that a similar bicultural arrangement between Irish Catholics and Protestants, nationalists and unionists, might succeed. And it was widely thought that, or assumed even, that either Louis Botha or Jan Smuts would chair this convention. Sir Francis Hopwood, Baron Southborough, a former Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, and Walter Long, the Colonial Secretary from 1916 to 1919, and a leading unionist, both recalled the success of the South African Convention in reconciling Boer and Britain in South Africa. And as Nicholas Mansergh has noted, this parallel looms so large in the minds of most Liberals and some Unionist leaders. Sir Leander Starr Jemison was briefly considered as the Chief Secretary for Ireland following the Rising, despite his reckless eponymous raid of 1896. And anti-Home Rule intrigues with Milner and Carson in 1912 to 14. He was invited to Ireland in 1917 by Lord Dunraven, a keen advocate of federalism, to advise on a political settlement, because he was seen himself as an advocate of Boer-British reconciliation when he'd become Premier of the Cape Colony in 1904 to 1908, and subsequently leader of the South African Unionist Party. The idea of an Irish convention drawn from a wide section of Irish society first came up in a conversation between John Redmond and the Marquess of Crewe, who as Colonial Secretary had overseen the South African Convention following a state banquet in honour of General Smuts. So you can see here the sort of continuing connections being made. It was, and of course, Smuts was hotly tipped now by this point, having become a member of the Imperial War Cabinet as a chairman of this committee. He'd just been also awarded an honorary Doctorate of Laws by the Imperial-minded Trinity College Dublin in the same year. In the event, it was chaired by Sir Horace Plunkett, the Irish Unionist leader, Irish Unionist reformer, a founder of the cooperative movement, who was also a sometime correspondent of Rhodes, Smuts, and John Xavier Merriman, a former Premier of the Cape Colony, who took a keen interest in Irish affairs. Plunkett went on, of course, to found the Irish Dominion League. He was so encouraged by the success of the South African Convention that he hoped that a momentous Irish agreement might be signed at his villa in the Dublin Mountains, the veranda of which he had modelled several years earlier on the stoep of Cecil Rhodes' homestead at Groote near Cape Town. The Irish Convention failed, however, and the political initiative was now passing back again from the constitutional strand of Irish nationalism to the physical force element, which within a few years would literally engulf Plunkett's constitutional dream house in flames. When guerrilla warfare developed in 1919 to 21, a succession of British commanders could draw on extensive South African military, if not political experience. I don't need to go into detail here, but Maxwell had been military governor of Pretoria during the South African War. General Macready, Commander-in-Chief during 1919-21, had been Provost Marshal in Port Elizabeth. Field Marshal Lord French, of course, famous Lord French of Kimberley, who had led operations against Cape rebels in 1901 and was keenly interested in the extension of martial law across the country. I should point out, of course, this is the first time that Britain had extended martial law in a country made up of white people. And this is, of course, how the British should deal with a white foe was very much, the Boer precedent was again, the single precedent there was for this at the time, as well as, of course, the precedent of guerrilla warfare. They had never before confronted a guerrilla force, at least not in living memory, as they had in South Africa before the Irish insurrection. And of course, there was also overseeing the Irish Revolution in the wider context was Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, who was also a veteran of the Boer War. Even more belligerent was Hugh Tudor, former divisional adjutant in South Africa, who raised the auxiliary division, and Frank Crozier, of course, another prominent member of the Black and Tan element of the counterinsurgency. And of course, if you go through the biographies of the auxiliaries that are available, it's quite interesting how many, there's a significant handful of veterans of not only of the Boer War, but of the Matabele uprising of the 1890s, and who were in the upper echelons of the auxiliaries and Black and Tans. It's quite interesting to think about this. Now, as I mentioned already, of course, advanced nationalists who advocated a violent break with Britain have been inspired by the small but symbolically significant Irish Transvaal brigades. Many of the veterans of the Anglo-Irish War, in both the Bureau of Military History, but also in the published memoirs, highlight the exemplary influence of the Boer War on their secessionist formation when Boer fever had appeared to grip the countryside. Dan Breen mentions it in the opening lines of his autobiography. As we're in Cork, so to speak, for this podcast, I should mention that Mícheál O'Sullivan, where Mountain Men Have Sown, his memoir of War and Peace in Rebel Cork, it mentions one of the memories of his childhood. The stories of and the discussions on the Boer War never ended without a reference to Ireland. Small wonder the handful of farmers who stood up against an empire and humiliated it set an example for the oppressed and downtrodden of the world. The example is not lost on the militant-minded in our own country. My uncle was one of these. It was from him that I first learned the only sure way to shake off the foreign oppressor. By the summer of 1921, the guerrilla struggle led by Michael Collins, nicknamed the Irish De Wet due to his admiration for the Boer general's strategy, had reached a stalemate. Donal Lowry said he would be amenable to conceding Dominion status if there were, as he put it, an Irish Botha in sight, but advocated a continuing hard line in the manifest absence of such a figure. Since Botha had died unexpectedly in 1919, leading British and Irish politicians urged the intervention of Smuts, who'd been warning about the poisoning impact that the Irish problem had on British relations with the USA and the Dominions. Smuts was already regarded as a maker of the 20th century, having been entrusted with secret wartime negotiations with Hungary, the foundation of the Royal Air Force, as well as playing a leading role in drawing up the Charter of the League of Nations, in which so many Irish people were to place their trust. While President Woodrow Wilson declined to become involved in the Irish crisis, Smuts's mediation elevated it to an international level of importance. Moreover, South African Irish activists have been disproportionately influential in the diaspora, and South Africa was prominent in Irish diplomatic initiatives. In 1922, there was an Irish race convention of the Irish diaspora held in Paris, which I needn't go into, but it was really on the initiative of the South African Irish Republican movement. No living statesman will be more acceptable to the majority of the Irish people than yourself, Plunkett assured Smuts, and he seemed singularly equipped to intervene. Not only had Smuts once fought the British to the end, but he had long-standing Irish friendships, including Alice Stopford Green, George Russell, or AE, Colonel Maurice Moore, the brother of the writer George Moore, and the Dáil Éireann's emissary to South Africa. Smuts was kept closely informed of the growing violence in the country by Casement Moore and Father Ryan, who was an Irish missionary priest there, and whose letters to Smuts are quite interesting. Smuts was also aware that Irish issues were having an impact on his own subcontinent. Speaking in Pretoria in February 1920, he used the Irish insurgency to counter Afrikaner nationalist arguments for a republic by pointing out the example of Ireland and warning that such a demand would get them, as in Ireland, tanks and airplanes and an army of occupation. This was in a very heated election. And one has to remember the deep divisions among Afrikaners over a treaty which their country was based on. I'll come back to the issue of the treaty in a moment. Later that year, there was an Irish symbolic involvement in an uprising of white miners in Johannesburg, which had an Irish commando and had a strong Irish Republican support locally. But also, as I've mentioned briefly, the Irish crisis was intruding once more into Rhodesia and Kenya. Kenyan settlers explicitly borrowed the tactics of Ulster loyalist direct action against Home Rule over the issue of Indian immigration to East Africa after the First World War. And Smuts's perceived sympathy with Irish nationalism was proving to be a political liability among those Rhodesian settlers he was attempting to woo into the Union of South Africa. It was thought at the time that Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, would naturally, inevitably join the Union. It indeed had sent delegates to the conventions I've just mentioned. And it was just a matter of time. But of course, this was not to be. And this is where the Ulster analogy came back to the fore again. At the 1921 Imperial Conference, which occurred at the time of the Irish truce, Smuts' thinly veiled criticisms of Britain's Irish policy earned the contempt of William Massey, New Zealand's Ulster-born and avowedly loyalist Prime Minister. But Smuts nevertheless played a key role, as I mentioned already, in helping to draft that speech I cited at the beginning. Tom Casement again sought Smuts's help as an intermediary. While the King's secretary told him, His Majesty is impressed with the beliefs that you, of all men, will be able to induce the Irish nationalist leader, Mr. de Valera, to be reasonable and to agree to a settlement. Smuts arrived incognito in Dublin, where he attempted at length, but unsuccessfully, to convince de Valera to accept Dominion status. I should mention that his incognito arrival was known by everyone in Dublin. He arrived as Mr. Smith. This was his sort of pseudonym at Kingstown, as it was then. But Oliver St. John Gogarty, one alumnus of my old school, incidentally, had donated his yellow Rolls Royce to take him into town in style, but Smuts had already left for central Dublin anyway. But it was the most open secret in Dublin, really, that Smuts was in town. De Valera was impressed by Smuts, but considered him to be the cleverest of all the leaders he met in the period, not excluding Lloyd George. There's also an amusing exchange between Smuts and his IRA driver in Dublin, when he explained to the IRA driver that the British had also tried to kill him near Bloemfontein in 1901, which is also another amusing aside. The visit is quite interesting in itself. So the constitution, the constitutional status which was offered by Lloyd George ultimately to Ireland was similar to that of the Dominion of Canada, but the negotiations leading to such a settlement were very different. As again, Mansberg has noted, the South African War had provided the British with their sole precedent for reconciling Republican guerrillas. The parallels were, in his words, arresting. Arthur Griffith, who succeeded de Valera as president of the Dáil, been a journalist in South Africa in the 1890s, and drew on the South African president of the Simonstown naval base in the negotiations regarding the use of Irish port facilities. He and Michael Collins, charged with carrying out the treaty, came to be regarded by Churchill as another heroic duarchy, which might prove to be allied, not unlike Botha and Smuts, if not a triumvirate, including the youthful, if ill-fated Commonwealth statesman and associate of Herzog, Kevin O'Higgins, a figure of antiquity cast in bronze. The name Irish Free State was coined by Lloyd George based on that of the Orange Free State, in order to provide a compromise term which fell short of a republic but did not overemphasize the monarchical aspect of the new Irish Dominion. This came in an exchange between de Valera and Lloyd George at Downing Street in which he asked, Lloyd George asked De Valera to translate literally Saoirse, and because Saoirse and Poblacht have been used interchangeably, but Saoirse was the more common term, and De Valera responded, well, it means Free State. We said, well, we have the Orange Free State, let's have the Irish Free State. So as Ireland erupted into a civil war, more bitter in many ways, and that waged against the British, Churchill, now colonial secretary, assured Collins, commanding the Free State Army, by quoting the words of the Boer leader, President Brand of the Free State, the Orange Free State, that is, which he'd heard after the South African War, "Alles sal regkom," things will work out. The settlement proved divisive, however, with pro and anti-treaty factions dividing and erupting, as we know, brother fighting against brother, mirroring the divisions of Afrikaners following the Boer War, and again in 1914 during the 1914 rebellion in South Africa. Collins, who was influenced by Alfred O'Rahilly and Duncan Hall, regularly cited the South African settlement of 1910 in support of the treaty. And this is because, of course, South Africa, because it was dominated by ex-Republican Boer guerrillas, was a much more better analogy, parallel to draw, if you want to argue for the potential of the treaty. In 1921, Collins wrote to his hero, General de Wet, in South Africa, assuring him of his respect. "You're right to accept the treaty," General de Wet replied. "Freedom will enable you to become strong and to organize yourselves." But a year later, Collins was killed in an ambush by regular forces. "We have lost our young Louis Botha," Tom Casement lamented in a letter to Smuts. "Ireland now sorely needed statesmanship and moderate leadership. 1 hour of Botha to solve the crisis," opined Lionel Curtis of Milner's Kindergarten, and who was involved in the treaty negotiations. So Collins's death marked a tragic end to the Louis Botha analogy, but the Anglo-Irish settlement continued to be framed by South African experience. Judge Feetham of the South African Supreme Court, again formerly of Milner's Kindergarten, faithfully chaired the Boundary Commission, which defined the Irish border. This is often wrongly assumed by critics of the Boundary Commission that Feetham was some sort of right-wing reactionary. In fact, he went on to become a very ardent anti-apartheid campaigner and a courageous university vice-chancellor in South Africa. So it's not quite as it seems. In the 1920s and early 30s, the Irish Free State and the Union of South Africa formed what Vincent Massey, the Canadian High Commissioner in London, called a fellowship of disaffection. These years were marked by cooperation in securing the Balfour Declaration of 1926 and the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which of course defined a Dominion status and enabled ultimately both Irish and South African secession from the Commonwealth. South Africa, although the least Irish and least Catholic of the Dominions, was the one with which Irish nationalists felt the greatest affinity. The Union was the least monarchical, but it also contained the most Republicans. Irish nationalists warmed to Afrikaners who disdained imperial titles. It's notable that Smuts never took a title, neither did Botha. Their Air Force wasn't the Royal South African Air Force. It was the least monarchical of all the Dominions. And also, there are plenty of other parallels. As in Ireland, politics in South Africa, in white South Africa has to be added, was fractured along similar lines among those who had fought their Republican former comrades in support of an imperial connection, embodied in a divisive treaty, as well as the presence of financially powerful loyalists, profoundly attached to imperial symbols and fearful of their minority position within the white electorate. So Natal, also Rhodesia, were likened to Ulster. They're constantly referred to as the Ulster of South Africa, especially Rhodesia. The state visit in 1930 of General Hertzog, the South African Prime Minister, of course more nationalist than Smuts, and more Republican-minded, was marked by mutual admiration and nostalgia for the days when they were anti-imperialist guerrillas, comrades in arms. In the and there continue to be South African influences in Anglo-Irish relations. In the 1930s, Afrikaner nationalists took a keen interest in Irish attitudes to the Commonwealth. believing that Ireland might point the way for them, heightening British fears that South African neutrality in 1939 might follow the Irish example. And there's a lot of, which I could mention, but you might want to ask me about, but a lot of connections in the 1930s between Republicans in the ruling Nationalist Party and Fianna Fáil particularly, of support, mutual support. And during the war, when Milan, who was then leading, not Dr. Milan, who was leading the opposition in Parliament, protested against Smuts siding with the Allies against De Valera's neutrality. Finally, just to wrap everything up here, this Commonwealth dimension had sort of echoes into the 1950s and later. In 1959, when Sean Lemass regretted that Ireland was now taking a position of opposition to South Africa over apartheid, stated nonetheless that they had enjoyed a long relationship marked by mutual sympathy. And they were still there because he was of that generation, and it was really he was the last of the sort of pro-Boer, or the generation that sort of was brought up on that sort of sentiment. But the Commonwealth dimension survived. In 1997, following the cessation of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, an independent International Commission on Decommissioning was established, which was chaired by a Canadian General, John de Chastelain, and Cyril Ramaphosa, the Secretary General of the African National Congress, and now President, of course, of South Africa. It's interesting that, generally speaking, many unionists prefer de Chastelain, who, of course, had taken an oath to the Queen of Canada, if not to the Queen of the United Kingdom. And the Commission of Inquiry into the Bloody Sunday shootings was chaired by Lord Saville, included Judge Sir Edward Summers of New Zealand, who, following his resignation for personal reasons, was replaced by John Toohey of Australia. Again, they respectively took their oaths of allegiance to the Queen of Australia and of New Zealand. This didn't seem to figure, fortunately, in the peace negotiations. And the Commission also included William Hoyt, retired Chief Justice of New Brunswick, who was appointed to examine controversial murders dating from the Troubles. So to conclude, I would just reiterate, say that we need to try, while looking at parallels with India and Palestine, and certainly India became more important in the 20s and 30s as regards revolutionary influences. In the immediate period of the War of Independence, indeed the years preceding it, the parallels were with the White Empire generally, and with South Africa, Southern Africa in particular. Thank you.
Donal, thank you. I mean, that's fascinating. And there are a series of questions it will be wonderful to ask you. And I hope we can bring you in person to West Cork next year when these things are possible once again, and pursue some of it. But just to pick up one or two strands in the time we have, I'm interested in that characterization by some in London of Botha and Smuts as a useful precedent for how dealing with Collins might play out. And there's a Collins-Griffith characterization as the Smuts and Botha of their era. How much did Collins himself embrace that? And clearly he's in touch with De Wet, but how comfortable is he with the analogy to Smuts or Botha?
In short, it's not known. In other words, there's no explicit expression of solidarity or of appreciation of that parallel. It is true to say that in his speeches, he singles South Africa particularly as an example, as the most prominent example of asserting autonomy as a dominion in the future. He doesn't explicitly mention Botha and Smuts. We can only speculate. As far as I'm aware, I haven't come across a more explicit than that. I think one of the other reasons why it occurs to the cabinet in London is that they keep on highlighting to the Irish delegates that, why don't you woo Ulster in the same way Smuts is trying to woo Rhodesia. That comes up in Thomas Jones's diary account of the cabinet meetings. So it's I think that's where it sort of becomes, it's more a projection, I think, of and a slightly romantic British imagination, especially Churchill, who's given to these kind of flourishes. So I think that's where it comes from, and I think he does say, as I mentioned to Collins, he quotes President Brand to him, Alice Salracum, things will sort itself out. Yeah. That his response to that isn't I haven't come across.
And it's also interesting to speculate whether the attempts to reconcile the divisions within Afrikaner society that followed the controversial treaty there might have been drawn on in thinking about post-Civil War reconciliation amongst Irish Republicans. I mean, but presumably, again, the period in which that might have been expanded on is too brief, certainly for Collins.
Yes, I think that's true. Yes, I mean, I think, and also, while observers in Ireland, and especially Irish nationalists, knew a lot of what was going on in South Africa, that's sort of they were enormously deep divisions in South Africa well, for decades after the war, especially among Afrikaners, between the bitter enders, and also they were hands-uppers, those who had surrendered to the British and ended up in the British forces fighting their own former comrades. So it has terrible parallels in many ways, and this affected people's employment, and also we also have to remember that South Africa until the 1940s, white South Africa was, especially Afrikaners, were very economically deprived. There was deep poverty among Afrikaners and right through the Depression years. And so these issues were extremely fractious in a way that, we've kind of forgotten in a way. We think of South Africa white South Africa as a land of swimming pools and people in fezzes serving drinks. It was never like that, actually, in a majority sense. It was always had its proletarian and deep class divisions, which were mapped onto, at least which you can see why people might have mapped them onto the Irish situation.
And this is something for another occasion, I'm sure, in detail, but to what extent in the early years of the Irish Free State did that sense of the imperial frame of reference continue from the point of view of people in the Irish Free State government? You can imagine, of course, it continues to do so for people in Westminster, but that sort of familiarity with South Africa, as you point to it, over many years from Redmond's time and indeed before it, was important. Is that a continuing feature?
Oh, it is certainly continuing. I mean, I've written elsewhere about this in more detail, but during the economic, I mentioned already about the close cooperation during the 20s up to the Statute of Westminster, but in the 30s, after De Valera came to power, the relationship between De Valera's government and Herzog, of course, who was much more similar type, sort of bespectacled language nationalist, a very strong sort of sympathy, mutual sympathies there. And it's quite significant. Deirdre McMahon points out in her book, which is a superb book of hers, 35 years old now, I suppose, Republicans and Imperialists, that one of the few occasions that the Fianna Fáil and Cumann Gael or Fine Gael politicians would attend the same gatherings in Dublin was when the Afrikaners came to town. And one of them was, of course, Nicholas Havenga, who was the South African Minister of Finance and an Afrikaner nationalist. And there are lots of interesting exchanges there at that time between them and reporting back Pretoria. Also at the 1932 the Ottawa 1932-33 Ottawa Conference on Economic Cooperation in the Commonwealth, the Irish delegation and the Afrikaners gravitated together at that. And also when at various just before Ireland stopped attending imperial conferences, the future Edward VIII used to be placed sitting between the two restless dominions, between the delegates of usually between Herzog and O'Higgins, or these were seen as the bad boys of the early Commonwealth in the 20s and 30s. But in the 30s, it was quite a strong. The other aspect was in 1932, from then onwards, during the economic war, there was a suggestion that the Dominions put pressure on De Valera to settle, and Herzog was persuaded to join in that coalition, if you like, of Dominions to gently but nonetheless firmly suggest that he settle. And this ruined, if he ever had any chance of chairing, because it was rumored that Herzog might be asked to chair an Anglo-Irish committee, reconciliation committee, if you like. But De Valera didn't want the Commonwealth to have a role on principle. But when Herzog appeared to support the other Dominions in this pressure on De Valera, the right wing of his party, because there were very Republican elements in the Nationalist Party, much more Republican than he was, and they sent telegrams to De Valera saying, thousands of Afrikaners support you, so going behind Herzog's back and saying you're an inspiration to us, you see. So, and it becomes also very, oh yes, this is another interesting parallel I should mention. But in 1939, a leading Afrikaner nationalist politician who later became their foreign minister in the 1950s and 60s, Eric Lowe, who had been the South African minister or diplomatic minister in Washington, incidentally. He was very anti-Smuts and very opposed to South Africa entering the war. And he gave a lecture at Stellenbosch, which is the sort of student prince-ish element or University of Afrikanerdom in the Cape, very Republican-minded, very Calvinist. And the lecture, which was later published, was in the summer of 1939, was titled Ierland toon die weg gaan, Ireland shows us the way. Lowe had become a friend of De Valera at and admirer at the League of Nations. And in his lecture booklet, he says that Ireland not only did show the way in terms of constitutional change and leaving and weakening the British connection, but also that its constitution, its new constitution, and this is quite interesting, given that he was lecturing young Calvinist Protestant Afrikaners who were very familiar with Reformation Sunday and Die Roomse Gevaar, the Romish menace, and all that sort of thing. Despite that element in Afrikanerdom, he said that the emphasis on the family and on the Holy Trinity was praiseworthy. And this also continued during the war years. The Milan, Dr. Milan, later architect of apartheid and the Nationalist Party, at their annual conferences, there's constant reference to Ireland showing the way to break the connection and neutrality, but also in Republican status. And it's this is also quite significant. In the early 50s, the South African High Commissioner to London, Dr. A.L. Khair, who was an Afrikaner political appointee, he'd been editor of Die Vaderland, which is like the Irish Press in the old days. It was the nationalist newspaper in South Africa. It's a sort of newspaper that when the royal family visited in 1947, had an editorial saying that the foreign family will be visiting Cape Town today, so avoid the centre of town. That sort of nationalist. Anyway, he came over to Dublin. He was High Commissioner to London, but of course, Ireland sort of came under the remit of the High Commission informally. And he was invited over. He met De Valera. And in his autobiography, all in Afrikaans, I might add, but in his autobiography published in the 1950s, Khair remarks that De Valera asked him about various things in South Africa, but he wasn't interested, no reference to apartheid. He wanted to know about the language, the Afrikaans language. And on being told that it was widely spoken, not only by Afrikaners, but also by mixed race colored people, his response was, "How I envy you, how I envy you." So
Well,
that's before De Valera. Obviously, he became more aware of apartheid later on. This is early 1950s, but at that time too, Sean MacBride, who much later became a sort of a High Commissioner for Namibia and very much in the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement, in the late 40s was very friendly with the Milan government. And when he met them in Paris, their delegation at an economic conference in the late 40s was extremely friendly and hoped that they would have a visit. And this comes up in the records in the late 40s. that the only reservation he had was that he thought they should invite both the South Africans and the Indians to Dublin, but don't invite them at the same time. With India, of course, and ironically, of course, this is another story again. Ironically, Nehru and Milan got on very well personally, which is again another one of those ironies. When you go behind all these, outwardly neat histories, they're not so neat when you start looking at them.
And if let us pause there. There is so much more we could cover, but that need to, as you say, look behind outwardly neat histories, and also to see, to the best of our abilities, people as they saw themselves rather than as we project onto them. Two lessons perhaps that will be applied in other parts of the topics we consider at the festival. But Donal, thank you. Fascinating to hear from you, and a privilege to listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon. Thank you.